NES Ice Climber is a game I recently played. After years of seeing these two in Super Smash Bros., I became pretty curious as to what their own game was actually like, and why they were included among Nintendo's icons in the first place. Oddly enough, the 1984 release in arcade and on NES is the only game outside of Smash that they've ever featured in, not counting any classic collection re-releases, the Animal Crossing NES games, WarioWare, and other stuff like that. In Ice Climber, you play as Popo, the purple boy one, while Nana, the pink girl one, only appears if you decide to play two-player. Sakurai chose to include them as a duo in Smash, likely to represent the early days of multiplayer gaming. The concept of Ice Climber is very simple, which I'd argue is part of its appeal. One button is to jump, and the other is to swing your hammer. That's it. But unlike most platformers, Ice Climber has you working your way up a mountain vertically, instead of the traditional side-scrolling left to right. The vertical climbing is really what makes the game unique. Even today, there are some platformers that have verticality to them, but there really aren't many that are explicitly vertical, especially upwards. This makes me think, could this style of game be successful today? Well, let's think about it. Out of the old school NES games I've played, Ice Climber is in the upper echelon. It's definitely not the best, but it's also far from the worst. The biggest complaint I have is the game's controls. There's barely any aerial drift on your jumps, collision boxes are really wonky and make you think you're landing safely on platforms when you're really not. Jumping toward a wall causes this inexplicable wall jump in the opposite direction, and there's just some all-around jank, like why can the enemies pass through this wall but not me? Often when I play old games, I get used to the controls over time and they no longer become as big of an issue. This is true for Ice Climber to an extent, but still stack these controls up to the platformers of today and it gets pretty rough. If Ice Climber had the snappy controls of something like a Shovel Knight or even a Donkey Kong Country, I could probably beat the whole thing in under 2 hours. If the climber did what I wanted to most of the time, the challenge would be considerably less. Practicing and mastering these somewhat unwieldy controls becomes part of the game. The controls here are difficult to master, which really adds to the game's overall challenge. And in today's gaming landscape, this might be something that's met with a lot more criticism than it may have in the past. If released today, the game will likely be downcast with accusations of having bad controls, which is part of the reason why, in my opinion, a straight up reboot or remake of Ice Climber probably wouldn't work very well. I feel that there would need to be a more creative approach taken and more substantial changes would need to be made. The good thing is, over the years we've seen thousands of 2D games, many of which play with different styles, ideas, and mechanics. And say, if they did want to revive the Ice Climbers, Nintendo could borrow inspiration from some of the successful 2D game styles of recent years for their reboot. That is, of course, if they don't create something completely new themselves, which is obviously something they're very famous for. The first thing that came to my mind when thinking about this, and was kind of the eureka moment that caused me to make this video in the first place, is the idea of Nintendo making Ice Climber into a procedurally generated game. In other words, a roguelike. For those not familiar, a roguelike is a game genre in which the upcoming elements the player faces are not pre-written. Rather, they're AI generated each play session. Binding of Isaac, Crypt of the Necrodancer, and Hades are all popular examples of this type of game. A game where you make runs and take on slightly different challenges each time. And deaths typically result in a game over, which will mark the end of a run. Today, this is an extremely popular genre, and Nintendo really hasn't tapped that much into it, aside from the Zelda roguelike, Cadence of Hyrule, which was developed externally. Judging from the original, I think Ice Climber is an IP that could work extremely well for this style of game. First of all, the idea of a procedurally generated mountain is an exciting one, as not knowing what obstacles are coming next would make each climb a considerable challenge, and would boost replayability quite a bit. Keep the hazards from the original game and then add even more. Expand the enemy roster to include more than just topies, nitpickers, and the occasional polar bear. And add power-ups that make your climber stronger, faster, and more durable as they make their way up the mountain. Pick up abilities and more moves on the ascent, creating a different build for your climber on each run, helping you face off against the increasingly difficult areas of the mountain. Then maybe shake it up and add some boss battles as you reach certain milestones. The way Hades Hades approaches it really sticks out to me as a successful example. Face off against a series of bosses as you progress through various phases of the mountain, and then a final boss at the summit, who would of course be the Condor from the original game, which we would need to defeat for a winning run. If you can't already tell, I'm a pretty big fan of this idea, and I think an Ice Climber's roguelike becoming Nintendo's own version of Hades is just wacky enough to kind of make some sense. My big question for a game like this would be, do we still travel up the mountain vertically? I mean, this is kind of iconic to the franchise and the whole point of the original game, but would a constant vertical ascent tire today's gamers out? It's hard to say. I think the verticality is what would keep a roguelike like this unique, and if there were boss battles, those could offer a shift in perspective to give players a few breaks from the vertical climb on each run. But at the end of the day, I think these are decisions that would be best made by the devs during playtesting. That being said, a roguelike is far from the only genre that could work for an Ice Climber's revival. I could also see the game being a straight up 2D platformer, and it could be made unique by starring Nana and Popo as a duo instead of just a solo climber. I could see a lot of interesting platforming elements being put into play here because of the dual climber mechanic. I'm picturing a duo jump like the high jump in Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, or even something like picking up the other climber and throwing them across a chasm to then step on a pressure switch that creates a bridge, something we've seen work well in Zelda 4 Swords. And of course, the belay. Their upbeat from Smash could be implemented some way into the controls as well. The duo dynamic, which was reserved for 2-player co-op in the original game, could be translated well to a modern single-player platformer. And adding an additional co-op mode where each player would control one of the climbers not only sounds extremely fun, but would be a great way to pay homage to the classic title. I could see Ice Climbers working in something similar to Celeste, a game that I think is undoubtedly inspired at least a little bit by the former. I mean, the whole point of Celeste is to climb up a mountain, and you collect fruit. Come on now. A 2D platformer that's built out as a series of challenge stages, each with eggplants and other fruits as optional collectibles, pretty much just like Celeste, seems like a natural fit for this Ice Climbers revival I'm imagining. And the more I think about it, the more I'm starting to like this idea just as much, or maybe even more than the roguelike one. By saying this next idea, I run the risk of people thinking this video is just pick a popular indie game and then apply Ice Climbers to it, which, I'm not gonna lie, is kinda what it's been to this point. But I can't deny a Metroidvania could also work well for Ice Climbers. Just about any IP could work as a Metroidvania, but Ice Climbers more so than many. The mountain climbing aesthetic would really lend itself well to the genre, as it could work as a reason to give the game's maps some extreme verticality. A huge, freely explorable mountain, complete with both caverns and outdoor sections, could be a really cool map idea for potential Metroidvania. The climber could start off at the mountain's base with just a jump and hammer like the original game, and then find various abilities as they explore more of the mountain, allowing them to climb higher and higher. The abilities and pickups would give them the ability to pass previously unpassable obstacles in classic Metroidvania fashion. Maybe it's not as exciting as the previous two ideas, but making Ice Climbers into this kind of 2D adventure game is something I could still see ending up really fun. There's really no end to game ideas Ice Climber could potentially work with. For example, maybe Nintendo could take a smaller and less risky step by reviving the franchise as a free Nintendo Online multiplayer game and make it a battle royale like Super Mario 35. Maybe keep the old school gameplay, but this time face off against 4 different colored climbers to see who can survive the longest and make it the highest up the mountain. You can't tell me that wouldn't work well. And like I said, this is a surprisingly versatile franchise I could picture coming back in a variety of styles. For me, I don't necessarily care how these dormant Nintendo characters are revived, so long as they are revived one day. I always think it's the coolest thing when Nintendo revives long-forgotten franchises. Like, obviously Metroid wasn't this dead, but seeing Metroid Dread finally made me lose my mind. So I'd really love to see one of the more obscure Smash characters finally get a modern release. I think Smash does a lot to generate interest in retro characters like this. And while some, like Duck Hunt or Game & Watch, might not be super well suited for a modern day revival, I think Ice Climbers in particular have a good amount of potential. Will we see a new Ice Climber game anytime soon? It's probably not likely, but you really never know what's going on in those Nintendo R&D rooms. And honestly, how long are they going to be just a Smash character before they're forgotten for good?